Hey everyone, this is Beverly, aka your public speaking mentor. It's 2021, and that means we have crowned a new world champion of public speaking. And that world champion of public speaking would be Verity Price from South Africa. And today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. Today I am going to be doing a deep dive analysis of a speech that isn't my own. We're going to dive into the latest speech given by the current world champion of public speaking and learn what choices she made, how she made them, what ways they affected her speech, and maybe even some ways that she could have improved the speech had she been given more time or had decided to do things differently. Now, to make this video, I stayed clear from all other evaluations and interviews with Verity and other world champions and other public speakers. This way, I could avoid any biases that would have occurred if I had reviewed them in advance. In addition to this, I also transcribed every word from Verity's speech, read it countless times over and over again, then watched her performance over and over again so that I could dissect all of the choices that she made and give my own opinion on how she made those choices and how, again, they affected her speech. And let me just say that these are my opinions and my personal feedback, therefore they should not be construed as any other thing other than my opinions and feedback. If you are familiar with my analysis, then you know that I will be breaking this into parts, and I will be providing my commentary as we go through each part of Verity's speech. If you want to see Verity's speech in its entirety, uninterrupted, then I will provide the link to that video in the description below. And as usual, if you get any value from this content, make sure that you press that like button down below and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already subscribed. Also, let me know if you want to continue to see other types of analysis from me. I will say that these analysis videos do take a good amount of time to create, so let's hit a goal of 80 likes. If we hit 80 likes for this video, I will do another analysis for one of the other previous world champions of public speaking. Now, for those of you who don't want to go through the entire analysis, let me just give a quick breakdown of Verity's speech. Verity's world championship speech, entitled A Great Read, was about 824 words given in about 7 minutes and 11 seconds. This means that she was speaking at about 116 words per minute, which is a fairly good speaking rate. Just to give you a comparison, my speaking rate in my world championship speech was 120 words per minute. And I gave that speech in about 6 minutes and 58 seconds. Yeah, I was speaking kind of fast. In addition, Verity's speech included 121 of what I call sensories. Now, you may be asking, what is a sensory? My definition of a sensory is any words or phrases or actions that are included in your speech which will evoke one of the 5 senses. In addition to the 5 senses, you can also appeal to other things like feelings and emotions. Most of the time, sensories will involve concrete nouns such as cat or a dog, or action verbs like running, jumping. Then you also have different types of feelings such as sadness, happiness. All of these can create a clear concept in the minds of the audience. In Verity's speech, she used an overarching theme of fairy tales. These are the fairy tales that we read and tell our children. It was a concept that she would bring up multiple times, and it helped tie the speech together in that way. Verity also used a one-story model in her speech, meaning that she told one entire story and then she ended with the point after her story was over. This is, of course, the same model that I followed in my World Championship speech and has been done in multiple previous World Championship speeches. Verity also told her story using past tense, which clears a misconception for a lot of people that you have to tell stories in the present tense. Remember, there is no such thing as the way to do something. There is only a way, and it is up to you to find your way. After all, if you really think about it, most of the stories that you read or were read to as a child were told in past tense. Also, if you review Verity's speech, you will notice that she is a very animated storyteller. However, when it comes to her body movement and her facial expressions, I never felt that it was over-delivered or overdone. Even though her movements were clearly choreographed, they were not unnatural movements. I could see Verity making these movements and gestures if she was telling this story to a group of family members or a group of friends in her real life. And speaking of over-delivery and over-performance, I just want to say a huge thank you to Verity for simply talking to the audience and telling us her story in a regular way. One thing that I personally preferred more in Verity's speech over the 2nd and 3rd place winners was that her story was told in a very simple way, And at no point did I feel that her performance was overshadowing the story and the words she was saying. If you follow my channel, you know that I am a huge believer in natural delivery. And this is coming from a guy who thinks that parts of his own championship speech were over-delivered. Another thing that I really enjoyed about Verity's speech is that she utilized what I call strategic vagueness. She was vague in certain parts of her speech so that it would allow the audience to be able to see certain things in their own way instead of her dictating every single detail in the speech. I'll explain more once we get to it. Now, in terms of what I think could have been improved in the speech, we're going to have to dive into the actual words that were spoken. So let's dive into the speech.
When I was a little girl, I used to love snuggling on my dad's lap while he read me fairy tales. Not surprisingly, I grew up wanting the fairy tale. To be happily married with beautiful kids, a gorgeous home, and a great career by 30. I never dreamed I would turn 40, unmarried, no children, and living in my sister and brother-in-law's spare room.
Now, in the beginning, Verity uses a lot of words that could be thought of as sensories, but a lot of them aren't necessarily concrete sensories. For instance, she talks about a house, which is definitely concrete, but I don't know what type of house. What type of house is a gorgeous house? It's a very subjective term. Also, the term married can definitely evoke some images, but it probably would have been more concrete had she said a husband. Career, also something that could evoke an image, but not very specific, as career is subjective to the listener. Now, I don't think that this is part of the strategic vagueness that I had mentioned before, but I do want to point out that if you want to use sensory evoking language, it is going to be easier for the audience to have a clear image in their head when they have more concrete nouns versus abstract nouns. Now, this isn't to say that abstract nouns are bad. It's just when you're talking about strategically engaging the audience's mind, it's easier to give them a quick, clear image rather than something that's more subjective. However, one thing that I will say is that you can get a lot of visual clues based on the way that Verity moves her body or gives a certain facial expression. Those simple actions can really add a little bit more color in the visual sense as the audience is looking directly at her. For example, look at Verity's expression when she talks about living in her sister's spare room. You can see from her facial expression that something is amiss here, something isn't right. We are able to understand that the character of Verity in this story is not in a happy place. Also, in terms of story setup, Verity did a great job of setting up a lot in her story within the first 30 seconds. In the first 30 seconds, we're able to establish the character of Verity in the story. We're able to establish the supporting character of the father in this story. We're also able to understand the problem that Verity has in this situation, where she wanted the fairy tale lifestyle, but she doesn't have that at this point in the story. So this is the problem that needs to be solved. When you are telling a story with a main character, you really want to establish the conflict and the problem that the character has as early as possible so that the audience has in mind what this speech is going to be about. Especially when you are using a single story model, you really want to make sure that the audience clearly knows who the main character is and what the problem is.
For my ego, this was a scary tale.
In this part of the speech, Verity mentions the scary tale. A play on words is something that can usually get a nice chuckle from a Toastmaster audience. But I must commend Verity for not overemphasizing this. A lot of times when we have a play on words, we tend to overemphasize waiting for this huge roar of laughter, but it's really not that funny. It's just a nice play on words. No need to dwell on it. Let's just acknowledge it and then move on to the good stuff.
So I hid in the spare room, eating ice cream and binge watching Netflix.
Now, this sentence was packed with sensories, both visually and verbally. She mentions the concrete noun of a TV, which of course sparks the image of a TV. She mentions Netflix, which may evoke the image of you watching Netflix, or at least the Netflix brand. She mentions ice cream, and ice cream, you can probably see your favorite ice cream. In addition, you can probably even taste the ice cream depending on what your favorite flavor of ice cream is. I like vanilla myself. That was just the verbal side. On the physical side, you can probably see Verity holding a bowl of ice cream. You can probably see Verity holding a remote. And she doesn't have to say that she's holding a bowl or a carton, and she doesn't have to say that she's holding a remote. You can just see it from her body movement. When she's doing her movement for the remote, you can probably see something scrolling on her screen or channel surfing. This was a great choice by Verity because she didn't have to use up the precious speech real estate to tell us all of these details. She didn't have to tell us about holding a bowl of ice cream in her hand. She didn't have to tell us about holding a remote and flipping channels. She showed that to us in her body movement.
Contest chair, have you ever noticed that at your worst, you always run into someone at their best?
Now, this is something that I just personally found interesting, that she addressed only the contest chair. If you didn't know, the speeches from the 2021 World Championship of Public Speaking were all pre-recorded. So there was no audience that was watching them live as they gave these speeches. Only the contest chair and the other contestants were present. So I just found it interesting that she accurately addressed the only person that was truly there. And of course, I just personally like it when people avoid the cliche opening of Mr. Contest Chair, fellow Toastmasters, and honored guest. Or that one that I absolutely despise, Contest Chair, fellow Toastmasters and guests, and anyone who has ever... Oh, shut up. It was cute and funny 10 years ago. Now it's time to stop.
I had dragged myself to the shops just to get more ice cream, thinking no one I know is going to be there.
Now here, Verity mentions the shop, and this was probably more colloquial to the language that's used in her area. But when I hear the word shop, I think of somewhere where you take your car to get it fixed. But when you are speaking to an international audience, you want to be mindful of the terminology that you use. You want to make sure that you're using the most universally accepted expression for the term that you are using. That way you don't cause any confusion. However, if you provide enough context clues, this shouldn't be a problem. I was able to discern after a couple of seconds that she meant the grocery store rather than the shop to take her car. Also, here was a nice use of internal dialogue. Verity was talking in her mind about nobody being at the shop at that time. Using a character's internal dialogue can really serve as a good way to add some variety to the dialogue exchanges without being intrusive to the story by physically adding another character.
But there she was, that friend. You know the one. Their life is perfect, and they tell you.
Now here's an example of that strategic vagueness that I was talking about. When Verity mentions that friend, meaning that you input your friend in this situation. That friend is a character in this story. However, the audience is taking their individual imagination and inputting their own friends in this situation. The only detail that we're given is that this character is a female. And when I was given these details, I was able to easily input one of my friends in this situation who is that type of friend. And again, what makes this a brilliant choice is that Verity doesn't have to take the time to explain what this character looks like, what this character sounds like. She is allowing us to do that work, and she doesn't have to take up that precious speech real estate.
Here I am, hand on fridge, stuck, having to hear how happily ever after she has ended up. Are you married? With kids? And your own business? And you bought a house? Me? Great.
Now there is so much to love in this section. Let's start with that pacing and tonality at the start of it. Here I am, hand on fridge, stuck. All of the words used in that part were single syllable, and they all followed a certain rhythm until she suddenly stopped it. That made it a lot more memorable. And that tonality was natural. It wasn't overdone. It was just perfectly executed. Also, very visual in the words that she says, but she's also visual with her body movement and expressions. You can see her hand on a fridge. And of course, you probably will put a handle on that fridge. You probably are creating the entire scenario of the grocery store as she's holding her hand on that invisible door. You can also see the expression of discomfort that she has when her friend is telling her about all of this good stuff. And again, all of it is done naturally and seamlessly. Nothing is forced here. And then she's using some slight changes in her tonality to contrast with what she is saying and doing at the same time. Her tone when she says happily ever after is told in this whimsical way, but you can see from her expression that there is a bit of sarcasm in there. She's not really interested in hearing all of these great things from that friend. Also in this section, there's more of that strategic vagueness. This time it comes in the form of what I call implied dialogue. Verity is repeating the words that are coming from that friend, but we are implying in our minds that that friend is telling her this in the first place. This is a great way to engage the audience's mind, and what makes it easier for the audience to buy this is the fact that it's mirroring everything that Verity, the character, wants in this story so far. So there's a clear connection to the beginning of the story. So it was a great way to remind us of the problem that Verity, the character, has in this story. And to tie this section in a nice big bow, there's the relatability factor, because we all have that friend who lives the perfect life and loves telling everybody about that perfect life. And we also have those moments where we compare our lives to that of our friends and we think that their lives are so much better than ours.
I wanted to die. I was a mess. My life was a mess. The spare room was a mess.
Here, Verity uses one of my favorite rhetorical devices, the anaphora, where she uses the word mess over and over again. However, I will say that the spare room being a mess was a bit left field for me, and the humor didn't land as well as it could have. Earlier in the speech, there was never any indication that the character Verity was living in a messy spare room. Had she alluded to that earlier, then it would have been a little bit easier for that humor to land. For example, I would have included this part where she's talked about eating ice cream, watching Netflix in a messy spare room. That way it would have been a lot more tight when used here.
But this was the mess where I found the last letter my dad ever wrote me. Seeing his familiar handwriting just flooded me with grief. Verity, your life is a book. And if you're not enjoying the read, write a different story. And then watch for a miracle, because I'm watching too. I shout at miracles, Dad, and how? How do I write a different story about this?
Now, this was an interesting word choice, and I believe it was done deliberately. This is a small detail with huge implications to a Toastmaster audience. Back in the old days of the International Speech Contest, there used to be this myth that you could not win a world championship unless there was somebody that passed away in one of your speeches. It became so prevalent that people started to become desensitized, claiming that contestants were manipulating their emotions by surprising them with death. But here, there are no surprises, and there's also no mention of the word death. Through these words, we are clearly able to understand that the character of the father, who we've already been introduced to briefly at the beginning of the speech, is no longer with us. And Verity doesn't have to outright say it to let us know. This could also be a useful way to talk about a deceased loved one passively if it's something that you struggle with talking about directly. Then Verity says that the letter flooded her with grief instead of simply saying filled her with grief. Flooded me with grief is going to be a heavier word, it's going to be a more image-evoking word, and that way it's a little bit more expressive than just simply saying filled. And even though the character of the father has passed away, we're still able to hear his words through the letter because Verity is actually reading the words of the letter instead of saying through narration that the letter says ABC. And after reading the letter, Verity responds back to her father in character, which makes it an exchange of dialogue between two characters in the story. A great way to add variety to the progression of the story without Verity, the narrator and speech giver, telling us every single thing that's happening.
To prove my point, I went to Facebook. And you guessed it, there were no stories of miserable 40-year-olds living in spare rooms.
Here with this Facebook reference, Verity is again trying to use a relatability factor, which is good. However, I think in the context of the story at this point, it would have been stronger to move this line further up in the speech so that when she's looking at all of those friends on Facebook, then that could be the catalyst that makes her want to hide and eat ice cream and watch Netflix in that messy room. This way we could establish again earlier in the story that Verity is embarrassed about her current predicament. Also for this Facebook line, I personally would have used the rhetorical question of, and guess what instead of you guessed it. However, using you guessed it was likely used because she wanted to add some you-focused language. You is more inclusive than I.
But the letter just lay there. It was like it was looking at me, almost whispering, write a different story.
If you personify an inanimate object and allow it to become a character in the story, it can move along dialogue or progress the story without the narrator having to tell you what's happening. It's also a way to add in some quick visuals, because now we see this letter having eyes. Reading this letter then led into the transition of her talking about her father. However, when it comes to that letter, I think it could have been a little bit stronger if Verity personified her father in the letter versus just personifying the letter on its own. For example, it could have been as if her father's eyes were watching her through the letter, or it could have been like her father was whispering to her through the letter. This could keep the father as a central character in the story and ease into that transition a little bit more thoroughly.
If anyone could write a different story, it was my dad. He wasn't a glass half full guy. He was a, aren't I lucky I've got a glass guy.
Here's another example of a twist on words. This time, Verity is switching up the cliche, a glass half full. And with this cliche twisting, she's able to help us understand in a more visual way that her father is a very happy-go-lucky, optimistic person. And actually, he's not even just optimistic. He is overly optimistic. This really sets a tone for who this character is, and it's done in a very simple way by a slight twist on words.
When Dad was 60, he lost his job. We lost our home, and we had to live in a camper van. But the story Dad told was, we get to live like we're on holiday. He never complained that he'd gone from a corner office to selling insurance, door to door. Instead, the story he told was, I'm working on my sales skills. And the miracle that happened, Dad was Salesman of the Year, and he bought us a new home. And even in our last phone call on his way to hospital, do you know what he said to me? Don't worry, V. You know I love breakfast in bed.
Here was another great use of not only you-focused language, but also utilizing a rhetorical question. This helped to change the engagement style with the audience. Verity was talking a lot just in story. So in order to engage the audience differently, she added in a quick question so that they could answer it quickly in their minds. Again, making it more inclusive of the audience. Also, to make this a little bit more personal, I like how her father used her nickname of V instead of calling her Verity. Just a nice little touch of personality. Also here, I like the idea of the dad carrying this humorous line because this is a very heavy moment. We know that he isn't going to make it past this moment. However, he's still bright, he's still optimistic, and it likely would have gotten a nice good laugh had it been told to a live audience, which would have lightened up people's hearts a little bit. Something to keep in mind when you're talking about a heavy subject, it's always good to bring the audience back up in their emotions, rather than just keeping them down with all the heaviness.
Shame hit me like a bus. My whole life, Dad had been showing me how to write a different story.
Okay, so here Verity uses a nice simile of shame hitting her like a bus. Similes, like all metaphoric rhetorical devices, are great ways to make abstract topics more concrete and visual.
So I picked up my pen. I looked at that friend and I thought, 40 is going to be my best chapter. I looked at the spare room and thought, this is my safe place to start over.
Now here I would have liked a little bit more clarity about the pen. Was it a proverbial pen or was it a literal pen that she took and wrote something down in a notebook? If it was literal, it could have added a little bit more visualization and more sensories. For instance, instead of saying the words I thought, she could have said the words I wrote, which would have sparked a visual in the audience's mind of writing. The act of writing is much more visual and concrete than the act of thinking.
I looked at my love life, and you know what I thought? I have got to stop kissing frogs.
Now here was another reference that came out of nowhere for me. Kissing frogs is obviously alluding to another fairy tale, specifically the Frog Prince. But in the story that we are hearing now from Verity, we never talked about her dating life. We never knew that it was bad. All we knew is that she wanted to marry someone, but at present, she hadn't married yet. When you're telling stories, you want to try to tighten up all of the inconsistencies. If you reveal something to the audience in a certain section, you want to make sure that they knew that it was coming or that you set it up earlier in the story. Now, I think this could have all been cleared up if early in the speech, Verity had just said that she dreamed that she would marry a handsome prince. That way it could have fit into the theme of the fairy tale as well as be a stronger connection to this reference here of kissing frogs. But another small detail here that I really love is Verity's micro expressions. When she's looking at this mess in her room, she gives this roll of her tongue that just makes us think that, okay, I have my work cut out for me. Very simple and very natural. It's probably an expression that she normally does. I don't even think she knew she was doing that.
When I wrote a different story, my life began to change. I went from feeling shameful to feeling grateful. And for the first time, I stopped worrying about where I wasn't. And I started enjoying where I was.
I like the use of rhyme and contrast here with shameful and grateful. Also notice that we are now starting to close out the character arc. We're letting the audience know that the character of Verity is applying the lessons that she learned, and even though her life isn't where it's supposed to be or where she thought it would be, it's coming to a point where she is now appreciating what she currently has. But now, remember, Verity alluded to some miracles that would likely be coming. So now the audience is getting ready for these miracles that should be coming up in the story.
And the miracle that happened? Within 6 months, I'd moved into a new cottage, much to my sister's relief. Within a year, I'd kissed a prince, much to my relief. At 44, I had a baby boy, much to my doctor's disbelief.
We're getting the happily ever after with the character getting everything that she originally wanted. Great section here with the repetition of the if sounds in those few statements that she had. The relief, then disbelief. Rhyming is always a great way to make your lines more memorable. Something else that makes this moment very memorable is the fact that she flashed her wedding ring. This is a nice use of a prop that is only visible when it's needed. And if it's not needed, you don't even notice that it's there. Also here we do get the connection to the kissing frogs earlier, where she finally kisses her frog and gets a prince. But again, it could have been more clear if we knew that she was looking for a prince earlier in the story.
This letter catapulted me into discovering that it doesn't matter who you are, where you are, what chapter of your life you're in. Something as simple as choosing to write a different story can make difficult circumstances a lot easier to deal with.
Another great use of a more visual word in place of a more simple word. The word catapulted was used here, and that made it a lot more expressive than if she had simply said, moved me. And now in this section, we have officially closed the story, and now it's time for us to hear the message. This is the speech part of Verity's presentation. And if you're wondering the difference between a speech and a story, the way that I like to think about it is that a speech is something that is more explicit with its message, and a story is more implicit with its message.
Now, I think you'll agree with me when I say the last 2 years have been a rough read for us all. But we've also written different stories. Ones where neighbors get to serenade each other and businesses get to pivot and innovate. And my all-time favorite was that time when we all waved our wands and bippity, your room turned into an auditorium and mine an international stage.
Now in this part, I like what Verity did by bringing it all back to a relatable topic of the present day, the problems of the present day that we have. I didn't quite understand the serenade reference. The Pandemic hasn't actually allowed me to serenade my neighbors. In fact, it has made me realize that my neighbors play music that's too daggone loud. Then we get more direct relatability to the specific Toastmasters audience. We talk about how we shifted and pivoted to going to a virtual format. And that is something that cannot be understated. Relatability is key when you are speaking. You always want to know your audience and apply your message directly to that specific audience. Also here was a great use of allusion. That is allusion, not illusion. The mere mention of Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo was a tie-in to another fairy tale, specifically Cinderella. More specifically, the fairy godmother from Cinderella. And again, all of that was done with just a few words rather than having to waste the speech real estate telling us about this illusion. One thing that I will say, and I do know this from experience, is to be careful with the placement of your microphone and the pitch of your voice, mainly how high your pitch goes. When she said Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo, it did kind of distort the sound a bit because she went a bit too high and her microphone probably peaked. She could have brought down the volume a little bit and it still would have had the same effect.
My fellow storytellers, do you know what I've learned? Fairy tales are great to read to my son. Real life is full of detours, delays, things that go wrong. But if your life is a book, then every day you get to decide, is your story being written for you or by you? When my dad reminded me that I was the author of my life changed. So if you're looking for a change, you want a new chapter, or you just fancy a miracle, pick up your pen and write a different story. Trust me, it's going to make for a great read. Contest chair.
Now here's where Verity actually talks to the audience. And to me, this is the exact place that you would want to do it, not at the beginning of the speech with an empty platitude. I am not going to go on my soapbox again, don't worry. Here I would have said our children instead of my son, just to make it more inclusive, because when you get to the end, you want that message to be more inclusive because you're talking directly to the audience before you close. And then at the end, we have the payoff of the title. And if you know me, then you know that I love making my titles work for me in my presentations. Also, just commend Verity for not making her title write a different story or something that was going to be more revealing, because that would have given the message of her speech within her title, which probably would have prompted many people to say, oh, I know exactly what you're going to talk about, long before she got to her message. All in all, I believe that this was a great speech with some great choices made. Verity, take a bow and welcome to the pantheon of public speaking world champions.